The next 48 hours were a masterclass in passive aggression. Alex Chen did not fill the tunnel. Instead, he complied with the letter of Karen's notice in the most infuriating way imaginable. He didn't resod the common area. He laid down a single, pathetic square of turf over the mudslide's epicenter, like a toupee on a volcano. He then erected a small, professionally printed sign next to it that read, "Future site of the Harmony Creek Memorial. Fountain for Spontaneous Joy EST 2025. His email had been a work of manipulative genius. It was folksy and wickedly funny. He included a picture of his kids, Tom and Lily, looking adorably mud-stained and happy. He referred to Karen only as the president, casting her as a shadowy, faceless bureaucrat. He admitted fault for the overzealous mud eruption and offered to personally replant the petunias for the president, but decried the $6,000 fine as a little steep for a bit of dirty laundry. He ended by inviting everyone to a community solidarity BBQ in his backyard that Saturday. The theme? Make mud, not war. The response was immediate and, for Karen, catastrophic. The neighborhood's private social media group, which she meticulously monitored, exploded with messages of support for Alex. "Kids need to be kids," wrote Mary Henderson from number 12, whose lawn was still a quarter-inch too long. "That fine is insane." Hashtag Team Alex posted the young couple from number 23. Someone even created a meme, Karen's face, grim and disapproving, photoshopped onto the body of a drill sergeant, with the caption, "Grass must be 4 inches. Fun is not authorized." Karen felt a siege mentality closing in. For 2 years since David's death, her authority had been absolute. Questioned, sometimes, but never openly mocked. Now, she was a punchline. Her morning patrols became exercises in humiliation. Neighbors who once offered polite, fearful smiles now gave her cool nods or averted their gazes entirely. She saw children pointing at her house and whispering. She was no longer the guardian of order. She was the neighborhood villain. The $6,000 fine remained unpaid. When Karen's lawyer, Harold, sent a follow-up letter, Alex responded, with a formal dispute. It was a surprisingly sophisticated document. He cited a loophole in the bylaw she had never considered. Section 9, subsection F, paragraph 4, concerning temporary recreational structures. It was a clause David had written, to allow for things like inflatable bounce houses for birthday parties or temporary above-ground pools in the summer. Alex argued that the tunnel was, in essence, a temporary recreational structure. He claimed the mudslide was an unforeseen operational byproduct and that since he intended to fill the tunnel at the end of the season, it fell under the temporary clause, which had a much more lenient set of rules and, crucially, a maximum fine of only $250. "He's an engineer, Karen," Harold said over the phone, his voice weary. "He's methodical. He's read the entire Book of Covenants. He's looking for stress fractures in the foundation you and David built." "Then we reinforced the foundation," Karen stated, her voice flinty. "Call an emergency meeting of the HOA board. We're adding a new bylaw, an amendment. Harold sounded alarmed. "That's a big step. It requires a full board vote. It can get messy." "Miscegeneous is preferable to anarchy, Harold," Karen snapped. "Draft it for me. Article 14. Subterranean excavations. All unauthorized boring, tunneling, or digging below a depth of 24 inches on any residential or common property is strictly prohibited. Penalty for violation $10,000 and immediate mandatory remediation at the homeowner's expense." 10,000, Harold gasped. "Karen, the board will never go for that. It's draconian." "They will if they understand what's at stake," she said, her eyes drifting to the photo of David. "Our property values. Our safety, the very principle of an orderly society." The emergency board meeting was held on a tense Wednesday evening in the sterile, beige-carpeted community center meeting room. The board consisted of Karen and 4 other residents. There was George, a retiree who always sided with Karen out of habit, Beatrice, a retired accountant who was a stickler for fiscal responsibility, a mild-mannered man named Robert who seemed perpetually afraid of his own shadow, and Mrs. Gable, a sharp-witted widow in her 70s, who had been on the board since its inception with David. Karen presented her case with cold, prosecutorial logic. She showed the videos, the photos, the engineering reports she'd commissioned which cost $800, a fact she omitted for now that detailed the potential for sinkage under the road. She framed Alex Chen not as a playful dad, but as a reckless anarchist chipping away at the bedrock of their community. "He calls it a tunnel slide," she concluded, her voice low and resonant. "I call it a liability, a precedent. If we allow this, what's next? Personal moats, backyard foxholes, unregulated fracking for lawn sprinklers. We must close this loophole before others try to drive a truck through it." George nodded vigorously. "She's right. Anarchy. I saw him buy a bag of unapproved mulch yesterday. Cedar chips. The covenant clearly specifies pine bark." Robert fidgeted. "Well, it does seem a bit much. The tunnel, I mean." But Beatrice and Mrs. Gable were harder to convince. $10,000, Karen, Beatrice said. peering over her bifocals. That's more than the fine for unapproved structural additions. We'd be finding a hole in the ground more than an illegal deck. It's about the principle, Beatrice, Karen insisted. It was Mrs. Gable who delivered the blow Karen hadn't anticipated. David wouldn't have liked this. Karen, the use of his first name was a physical jolt. What did you say? Mrs. Gable's eyes, usually twinkling with wry amusement, were serious. I knew your husband for 20 years. He wrote most of this book, she said, tapping the covenants. He believed in rules, yes, fiercely, but he also believed in community. He knew that sometimes you had to bend a little to be a human being. He once let my grandkids build a treehouse that violated 3 different height and material restrictions because he saw the joy it brought them. He made me file for a variance after the fact. Of course, she added with a small smile. But he understood the spirit of the law, not just the letter. This feels personal. It feels vindictive. Karen felt the blood drain from her face. To have David's own legacy used against her, by one of his oldest friends, was a betrayal she couldn't fathom. This is not vindictive. This is about protecting what he built, is it? Mrs. Gable asked softly. Or is it about punishing the man who ruined your petunias and made you feel foolish? The question hung in the air, thick and uncomfortable. Carefully constructed armor of righteousness cracked. For a fleeting second, she saw herself through their eyes. A lonely woman, clinging to rules because she had nothing else. The image was so painful she immediately walled it off with anger. We're voting on Bylaw Amendment 14, she said, her voice brittle. All in favor of prohibiting subterranean excavations. She raised her hand. George's shot up immediately. Robert, after a moment of agonizing indecision, slowly raised his. 3-2-2. She had the majority. Opposed. Beatrice and Mrs. Gable raised their hands without hesitation. The motion passes, Karen declared, slamming her gavel down with more force than necessary. The amendment is adopted, effective immediately. She had won, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. She had strong-armed her own board, creating a rift between herself and Mrs. Gable, her last remaining link to David's era. The consequence of her decision to force the issue was the erosion of her own power base. She was isolating herself, becoming the monarch of an ever-shrinking kingdom. The next day, a notice detailing the new bylaw was posted on the community bulletin board and emailed to all residents. The fine of $10,000 was highlighted in bold red. It was a declaration of total war. That evening, as she sat in her silent living room, a different kind of email arrived. It wasn't a mass mailing. It was addressed only to her and the other board members. Beatrice, George, Robert, and Mrs. Gable. The sender was Alex Chen. The subject, a question regarding HOA financial transparency. The email was short and polite. It referenced Section 2, Subsection C of the bylaws, which guaranteed any homeowner the right to inspect the HOA's detailed financial records with 72 hours' notice. The body of the email read, Dear President Peterson and members of the board, pursuant to the rights afforded to me as a homeowner in good standing, I would like to formally request access to the complete, unredacted financial ledgers, balance sheets, and vendor contracts for the past 5 fiscal years. As an engineer, I have an appreciation for well-managed systems, and I'm simply curious to see how our community's funds are allocated. I am available to begin my review this coming Monday. Sincerely, Alex Chen. Number 14. Karen stared at the screen, a cold dread creeping up her spine. This was a new front in the war, one she was not prepared for. The tunnel was a physical attack. The email campaign was a social one. This was strategic. He wasn't just a playful dad anymore. He was an opponent who had identified a new, potentially devastating vector of attack. The HOA's finances, they were, to her knowledge, impeccable. Beatrice was a hawk, and Karen herself was meticulous. But 5 years stretched back into the time before David had passed when he was managing the books himself. There was nothing to hide, she told herself. Nothing at all, but the confidence she projected to the world was a lie. There was one thing, a lot. The weekend was the longest of Karen Peterson's life. Alex Chen's BBQ was, by all accounts, a roaring success. From her living room window, a vantage point that was rapidly becoming her command bunker, she watched half the neighborhood traipse into his backyard. The smell of grilled hot dogs and forbidden cedar mulch smoke wafted across the street, a scent of populist rebellion. Laughter echoed in the twilight. It felt like they were celebrating her demise. She spent Saturday and Sunday not in a panic, but in a state of hyper-focused preparation. She retreated to David's study, the one place she felt his presence, and pulled out 5 years of financial binders. The room was a shrine to order, pens aligned in a perfect row, books organized by subject and height, the faint scent of old paper and his bay rum aftershave still clinging to the air. For a moment, grief washed over her, so sharp and sudden. It felt like the day she'd lost him. He would have known what to do. He would have faced Alex Chen with a calm, unshakable authority that she felt slipping through her fingers. Let's see what you've gotten me into, David, she murmured, opening the first binder. For hours she worked. The books were, as she'd expected, mostly pristine. Beatrice's neat, Spidery handwriting chronicled every dollar spent on landscaping, pool maintenance, insurance, and legal fees. It was all there. Except for Viridian Solutions, the payments were made quarterly, $15,000 every 3 months. Like clockwork, $60,000 a year. For 5 years, a total of $300,000 paid from the HOA's reserve fund to a company with no clear purpose. The invoice description was always the same: community enrichment and strategic planning. It was maddeningly vague. She searched for a contract, a proposal, anything that would explain what Viridian Solutions was or did. She found nothing. No file, no correspondence, no introductory letter. It was a ghost in their accounting, a ghost that siphoned a significant portion of their reserves. Her paranoia began to spiral. What was this? A slush fund? A kickback scheme? The thoughts were treasonous, a betrayal of David's memory, but she couldn't suppress them. David was a man of integrity, unimpeachable. But what if he had a secret, a vulnerability? Desperate, she called Beatrice. Beatrice, it's Karen. I need to talk to you about Viridian Solutions. There was a pause on the other end of the line. I was wondering when that would come up, Beatrice said, her tone guarded. Knew this would be a problem. I knew a curious man like Mr. Chen wouldn't just glance at the top line of a budget, Beatrice replied. Karen, I told you what I know. David set it up. He told the board it was for a long-term legacy project for the community, and that the details needed to remain confidential for negotiation purposes. He was very convincing. We trusted him. It was a unanimous vote of approval to establish the fund. A legacy project. What kind of project costs $300,000 and produces nothing for 5 years? Karen demanded, her voice rising. I don't know, Beatrice admitted. After he passed, you became president. You never asked to dissolve. The payments? You kept signing the checks. I assumed you knew what it was for. I thought you were carrying on his plan. The words hit Karen like a physical blow. I assumed you knew. She had been so focused on enforcing the small rules, the superficial order of lawns and mailboxes, that she had completely ignored the single largest expenditure in their entire budget. She had been a diligent warden, but a negligent steward. Her authority, which she had wielded like a weapon, was built on a foundation of ignorance. A new terrifying thought emerged. If Alex Chen found this, he wouldn't just see mismanagement. He would see a cover-up. He would assume she was the one, hiding something, that Viridian Solutions was her secret. Her crusade against his tunnel would be reframed as a desperate attempt to distract from her own financial malfeasance. The recall she'd feared would become a certainty. She could even face legal trouble. Her decision was instantaneous. Born of fear and self-preservation, she had to block him. She spent the rest of Sunday researching. She scoured the Book of Covenants, the very text Alex had used against her, searching for her own loophole. She found it, buried in a section on data security that David had written after a minor phishing scam hit the neighborhood years ago. Appendix G, Protection of Sensitive Community and Vendor Information. It gave the HOA president the authority to temporarily restrict access to financial records. If there was a credible belief that such access could compromise ongoing contractual negotiations or expose proprietary vendor data, it was thin. It was a transparently defensive maneuver, but it was all she had. On Monday morning at 9 a.m., Alex Chen, dressed in smart casual chinos and a button-down shirt, presented himself at the community center. He carried a laptop bag and a thermos of coffee. He looked ready for a long day of document review. Karen was waiting for him, seated alone at the long table in the meeting room. She had the financial binders stacked neatly in front of her. She had let him see them, to let him think he was winning. Mr. Chen, she said, her voice a carefully modulated monotone. Good morning, President Peterson, he replied, with a polite nod, his eyes flicking to the binders. Ready to get started? There's been a change of plans, Karen said, folding her hands on the table. Pursuant to Appendix G of the HOA bylaws, concerning the protection of sensitive vendor information, your request for full access has been temporarily denied. Alex's polite expression didn't falter, but a flicker of something or perhaps respect for the audacity of her move showed in his eyes. Appendix G. That's for protecting active negotiations, isn't it? Are you telling me the HOA is in the middle of a top-secret deal? I am telling you that I have exercised my authority as president to protect what I deem to be sensitive information, Karen stated flatly. You are welcome to review a summarized budget, which I have prepared for you. She pushed a single 2-page document across the table. It was a high-level overview, showing broad categories like landscaping and maintenance. The Viridian payments were bundled into a miscellaneous line item called Approved Community Grants. Alex picked up the summary and glanced at it for less than a second before setting it down. He let out a soft, humorless laugh. You can't be serious. This is an insult. It is what I am authorized to provide at this time, Karen said, her heart hammering in her chest. She was bluffing. They both knew it. You know, I was starting to think this was all just a big misunderstanding, Alex said, his voice losing its friendly edge and taking on the sharp precision of a litigator. I thought you were just a bit overzealous. But this is different. This isn't about rules anymore. This is a cover-up. What are you hiding, Karen? The use of her first name, spoken with such accusatory force, stung more than any of the neighborhood gossip. I am hiding nothing. I am protecting this community, a task you seem to find amusing. I find it amusing that you think this will work, he countered, leaning forward slightly. You declare war on my kid's mudslide, invent a 10th fine out of thin air, and when I ask to see where our money is going, you lock the books down like it's Fort Knox. What do you think the rest of the neighborhood is going to think? He didn't need to elaborate. She knew exactly what they would think. Her move, intended to buy her time, had just handed him a nuclear weapon. The consequence of her secrecy was that it created the irrefutable appearance of guilt. Your opinion of what the neighborhood thinks is of no concern to me, she lied. It should be, Alex said, standing up and slinging his laptop bag over his shoulder. Because my next email to them is going to be a doozy. It'll have your picture, a copy of my formal request, and a copy of the bylaw you're hiding behind. And the subject line will be, where did $300,000 of our money go? I'll also be including a petition to hold a special meeting. The purpose of the meeting will be to vote on your immediate recall as HOA president. He walked to the door, and paused. His hand on the knob, he turned back to look at her, his expression no longer angry, but something closer to pity. You know, for what it's worth, I get it. This place, these rules, they're all you have left of him, aren't they? But you're strangling the life out of this community to preserve a memory. And I think, deep down, you're terrified that the memory you're protecting isn't as perfect as you thought it was. He left. The door clicked shut, leaving Karen alone in the silent room with the useless summarized budget and the heavy, damning binders. His words had struck home with surgical precision. You're terrified that the memory you're protecting isn't as perfect as you thought it was. That was the truth. Her fight with Alex, her obsession with the rules, her desperate attempt to block the financial review. It wasn't about protecting the HOA. It was about protecting her image of David, the perfect husband, the visionary founder. She had built her entire life for the past 2 years around the polished monument of his memory. Now Alex Chen was threatening to reveal that the monument might have a crack in its foundation. And the Viridian ghost, the $300,000 ? Was the chisel he would use to break it all apart. She went home, not to David's study, but to her own bedroom. She opened her closet and pushed past the neat rows of sensible suits until she reached the back. There, in a dusty box, were photos from before Harmony Creek, photos of her and David Watt. The petition for Karen Peterson's recall landed in every Harmony Creek mailbox 2 days later, delivered by Alex Chen's own children, who dutifully and cheerfully trotted from door to door. The document was a masterpiece of populist propaganda. It laid out the timeline with devastating clarity: the mudslide, the exorbitant and punitive fine, the authoritarian creation of a new bylaw without resident consultation, and the final, damning actor refusal to allow a financial review, juxtaposed with a suspicious, 6-figure black hole in the budget. The neighborhood, already simmering with resentment, boiled over. Signatures were gathered with alarming speed. Within a week, Alex had more than the 30% of households required by the covenants to force a special meeting. The notice was formally served. The showdown was set for the following Thursday in the community center auditorium. The sole agenda item, a vote of no confidence in, and proposed recall of, HOA President Karen Peterson. The week leading up to the meeting was a blur of misery for Karen. The whispers were no longer whispers. They were open speculation. Do you think she stole the money? She overheard a neighbor say at the mailbox, I bet that's why she's so obsessed with the rules, to distract everyone. Her authority was completely gone. She was a pariah. Even George, her staunchest ally, seemed to be avoiding her calls. Her nights were sleepless. She abandoned David's study, the place of order, and instead worked at her chaotic dining room table, surrounded by the 5 years of financial binders. She was no longer trying to hide the Viridian payments. She was trying to understand them. She cross-referenced dates, looked up the company online, finding only a generic corporate registration with a P.O. box in Delaware, and searched David's old emails and computer files. Nothing. It was a digital and physical dead end. The stress was taking a physical toll. Dark circles formed under her eyes. Her perfectly tailored suit seemed to hang off her frame. One evening, trying to force down a piece of toast, she caught her reflection in the darkened kitchen window. She saw a haunted, frantic woman, a far cry from the iron-willed matriarch she projected. She looked like the villain everyone imagined her to be. It was Mrs. Gable who broke the siege. She appeared at Karen's front door 2 days before the meeting, holding a peace offering, a lemon bundt cake. Thought you could use this, Mrs. Gable said, bypassing any awkward pleasantries and walking straight into the kitchen. She stopped short, taking in the scene of the dining room, covered in financial documents, or maybe an accountant. Karen felt a flush of shame. I'm just organizing. Karen, stop, Mrs. Gable said gently. She cut a slice of the cake and put it on a plate in front of Karen. We need to talk, not as board members, as friends. As the last 2 people in this neighborhood who truly remember what David was like. Karen stared at the cake, her throat tight. He wouldn't have stood for this. The inspiration, the chaos. No, he wouldn't have, Mrs. Gable agreed. But he also wouldn't have hidden the books, Karen. That's what's killing you with the residents. It makes you look guilty as sin, and it's not like you. She paused, her gaze kind. Tell me what you're so afraid of them finding. The dam of Karen's composure, weakened by weeks of stress and loneliness, finally broke. The whole story poured out of her: the discovery of the Viridian payments, the lack of any documentation, the fear that David had some terrible secret, that he wasn't the man she thought he was. She confessed her terror that her entire life's mission, preserving his legacy, was based on a lie. Mrs. Gable listened patiently, her expression unreadable. When Karen was finished, her voice raw with unshed tears, the older woman took a slow sip of her tea. So you think David was a crook? She asked bluntly. No, I don't know what to think, Karen whispered. But $300,000, Beatrice, it's gone. It's not gone, Mrs. Gable said. It was spent. The question is on what? She leaned forward. Karen, what are you going to do at that meeting? Are you going to go in there with your rules and your appendices and fight them? Because you will lose. You've already lost the popular vote. What else can I do? Karen asked, her voice laced with despair. Admit I have no idea where the money went. They'll crucify me. Maybe, Mrs. Gable said, her eyes sharp. Or maybe, for the first time in 2 years, they'll see a human being instead of a walking bylaw. Maybe you should stop defending the president and start talking like Karen Peterson. Stop defending the memory of a perfect man and talk about the husband you loved, flaws and all. The advice was terrifying. It required a vulnerability she hadn't shown to anyone since David's funeral. It meant surrendering her armor, her only defense. In the middle of the battlefield, the night of the recall meeting, the community center auditorium was packed. Every seat was filled, and people stood along the walls. The air was thick with anticipation, a gladiatorial atmosphere. Alex Chen and his family sat in the front row, looking somber and determined. Beatrice and Robert sat together, looking deeply uncomfortable. George sat by himself, pointedly not looking in Karen's direction. Mrs. Gable gave her a small, encouraging nod as Karen took her place at the podium on the stage. The meeting began. As per the bylaws, Alex, as the petitioner, was given the floor. First, he was brilliant. He didn't shout or accuse. He spoke calmly and reasonably, laying out his case not as a personal vendetta, but as a plea for the community's soul. He used humor, describing the great mudslide of '25 with a light touch that got a few chuckles. He spoke of the need for community, for children to play, for neighbors to be neighbors and not potential litigants. He praised David Peterson's vision but suggested that in the years since his passing, that vision had become calcified, the rules becoming more important than the people they were meant to serve. Then his tone shifted. He brought up the finances. He spoke of transparency and accountability. He held up the petition. This isn't just about a tunnel or a fine, he concluded, his voice ringing with sincerity. It's about trust. We, the homeowners of Harmony Creek, deserve to trust that our leadership is transparent, fair, and acting in our best interest. Recent events have broken that trust. It is with a heavy heart, but a clear conscience, that I ask you to vote yes on the recall of President Peterson. He sat down to a wave of thunderous applause. Karen felt her stomach plummet. There was no way to win against that. He was St. George, and she was the dragon. Then it was her turn. She walked to the podium, her hands shaking slightly. She had a speech prepared, full of legalistic defenses and procedural points. She looked down at her notes, then out at the sea of hostile and expectant faces. She saw the Hendersons, the young couple from number 23, her own board members. In their eyes, she saw her conviction. They had already found her guilty. She looked at Alex. He held his daughter's hand, his expression unyielding but not gloating. He was a father protecting his family's right to be happy. In that moment she made a decision. She pushed her prepared notes aside. She took a deep breath and leaned into the microphone. Mr. Chen is right, she began. The hall fell silent. The shock was palpable. He's right, she repeated, her voice softer, more hesitant than they had ever heard it. Trust has been broken, and I am the one who broke it. She didn't look at any notes. She looked directly at the crowd, her gaze moving from face to face. For the last 2 years, since my husband David passed away, I have dedicated myself to one thing, upholding the rules of this community. I saw it as my duty. I saw it as the only way to honor the man who poured his heart and soul into building this place. Her voice cracked, but she pushed on. I believed that if I could keep every lawn at exactly 4 inches, and every mailbox the correct shade of beige, I was keeping his memory perfect. I was keeping him alive, in a way, but I was wrong. I wasn't preserving his legacy. I was hiding in it. I let my grief turn me into something rigid and unfeeling. I saw a child's messy game, not as a moment of joy, but as a personal attack. I saw a neighbor's question not as a right, but as a threat. I stopped seeing all of you as neighbors and started seeing you as potential infractions. She paused, taking a shaky breath. And when Mr. Chen asked about the finances, I panicked. I did exactly what he said I did. I hid the books. And I am sorry for that. She then addressed the elephant in the room. You want to know about the $300,000 paid to a company called Viridian Solutions? The truth is ... I don't know what it's for. A gasp went through the crowd. This was the confession they'd been waiting for, but it wasn't delivered with defiance. It was delivered with a raw, painful honesty. It was a fund my husband established for something he called his legacy project. He kept the details confidential. When he died, I was afraid to touch it, afraid to change anything he had set in motion. I just kept signing the checks, assuming I was fulfilling his final wishes. It was a mistake. It was gross negligence, and I take full responsibility for it. I was so busy enforcing the letter of David's law that I failed to uphold its spirit, the spirit of trust, of community, of transparency. She looked directly at Alex. My actions were driven by fear and by grief. That's not an excuse. It's just the truth. I cannot ask you to trust me as your president anymore. I haven't earned it, she finished, her shoulders slumping. That's all I have to say. We can proceed with the vote. She walked back to her chair in a stun. In the week that followed the failed recall, a strange quiet fell over Harmony Creek Estates. The battle was over, but no one seemed sure who had won. Karen Peterson was still the HOA president, a fact recorded in the official minutes, but the title felt hollow. Her morning patrols ceased. The telescoping ruler remained in a drawer. When she saw Mrs. Henderson's lawn creeping toward 4.5 inches, she simply looked away. The will to enforce, the righteous fire that had fueled her for 2 years, had been extinguished by her public confession. Her relationship with the community was fractured and uncertain. Some neighbors offered her tentative, sympathetic smiles. Others, the diehard #Team Alex contingent, still viewed her with suspicion. She was a leader with no followers, a ruler in exile in her own home. The stalemate was broken by an unexpected visitor. On a cool evening, as Karen was picking at a salad she had no appetite for, the doorbell rang. It was Alex Chen. He wasn't holding a petition or a notice of violation. He was holding 2 bottles of beer. Is the war officially over? He asked, his tone unreadable. Or do I need to check these for compliance with the HOA's approved beverage list? Karen stared at him, bewildered. What do you want, Mr. Chen? The name's Alex, he said. And I think, considering we just survived the neighborhood equivalent of a civil war, we can drop the formalities. Can I come in? Hesitantly, she stepped aside. He walked into her pristine living room, a stark contrast to his own perpetually toy-strewn home. He placed the beers on her glass coffee table. I don't drink beer, Karen said automatically. I figured, Alex replied, twisting the cap off one for himself. Look, your speech at the meeting, ... It took guts. I came here expecting a fight too. The death with the dragon lady, I didn't expect to see. Well, a person. I am still the president of this association, she said, the words lacking their former conviction. Technically, he agreed. But you and I both know you can't rule by decree anymore. Your mandate is gone, and frankly, my burn-it-all-down approach has its limits. We have a neighborhood to run. He took a swig of his beer. You have the institutional knowledge. I seem to have the popular support. It seems to me we have 2 choices. Continue this Cold War until the neighborhood falls apart, or we figure out how to work together. The idea was absurd. Working with the man who had publicly humiliated her, who had turned her life upside down, but he was right. The community was divided and adrift. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting we form a committee, he said. The Bylaw Review and Financial Transparency Committee, co-chaired by you and me. We go through the Book of Covenants, page by page, and find a middle ground between your order and my chaos. And we figure out what the hell Viridian Solutions is, together, openly. It was a truce. More than that, it was a power-sharing agreement. It was a concession of defeat for her, but also, strangely, a lifeline. The thought of tackling the Viridian mystery alone was overwhelming. Fine, Karen said, the word feeling foreign in her mouth. On a probationary basis, a slow smile spread across Alex's face. Excellent. Our first act as co-chairs. I move that we officially sanction the temporary existence of the Tunnel of Muddy Fun, pending a full safety review by a neutral third party. Karen's eye twitched. I will take it under advisement, and so began the unlikeliest of alliances. Their committee, meetings held at her dining room table, became a fixture of neighborhood curiosity. The first few were tense, a verbal chess match. Alex would argue for relaxing the rules on fence heights. Karen would counter with concerns about property line disputes. He'd propose allowing more vibrant front door colors. She would present a study on the psychological impact of clashing hues on community harmony. But slowly, a strange rhythm developed. She found his engineer's logic compelling when applied to things like water usage regulations, and he, in turn, began to appreciate her meticulous attention to detail when it came to safety protocols for the community pool. She was the immovable object, he was the irresistible force. And together, they were finding a new point of equilibrium. She even found herself changing. One afternoon, she saw a family setting up a large, unapproved bounce house for a child's birthday party. The old Karen would have been there in minutes, clipboard in hand. The new Karen hesitated. She called Alex. We have an unpermitted inflatable recreational structure at number 17, she reported, the old language coming naturally. There was a pause on the phone. Karen, Alex said patiently, is a child having a birthday party? The presence of a cake and balloons would suggest so, she conceded. Then I believe the official committee response is, try to snag a piece of cake if you can. Karen almost smiled. I'll take it under advisement. The real work, however, was the Viridian investigation. With the full, albeit reluctant, blessing of the board, they hired a forensic accountant. They delved back into the binders, no longer as adversaries, but as partners in a deepening mystery. They confirmed the P.O. box in Delaware was a dead end, a shell used for thousands of corporations. The payments were wire transfers, authorized by a form David had created, which only required the signature of the president and one other board member. In the past, it had always been David and Mrs. Gable. For the last 2 years, it had been Karen and Beatrice, the forensic accountant. A sharp woman named Ms. Davies found the first real clue. The Viridian account that receives your funds isn't a corporate account, she explained one afternoon, pointing to a line on a bank statement. After the money is deposited, it's immediately transferred to a series of personal, interest-bearing accounts. This isn't a vendor. This is a wealth management portfolio. Karen and Alex exchanged a look. So the HOA's reserve funds were being invested? Alex asked. Not just invested, Ms. Davies said. Hidden. The structure is designed to obscure the ultimate beneficiary. It's sophisticated. But there's one name that keeps cropping up in the sub-account authorizations. An initial signatory from before the automatic transfers were set up. She slid a document across the table. It was a copy of the very first transfer authorization, dated over 5 years ago. It was for a seed payment of $25,000 to establish the fund. It required 2 board member signatures. One was clear and firm, David Peterson. The other signature, a looping, elegant script, made Karen's blood run cold. It wasn't Beatrice. It wasn't any of the other board members she knew from that time. It was a name she recognized with a jolt of disbelief. A name that made no sense. It was George. Mild-mannered. Sycophantic George, the retiree who always sided with her, the man who had railed against Alex's unapproved cedar mulch. There must be a mistake, Karen breathed. George wasn't on the board then. He was appointed to fill a vacancy 3 years ago. Then what is his signature doing on a 5-year-old document authorizing a secret fund with your husband? Ms. Davies asked, her question hanging in the air like a death sentence. The pieces began to click into place with horrifying speed. George, who always knew which bylaws to cite in her defense. George, who had access to the HOA offices. George, whose loyalty had seemed so absolute. And George, who, as Mrs. Gable suddenly recalled when they called her in a panic, had been the chairman of the Financial Advisory Subcommittee under David, a position he'd quietly relinquished right before joining the main board. The realization was sickening. The legacy project was a lie. David had likely been duped. George must have convinced David to set up the confidential fund, using his financial expertise to create the convoluted structure. He had used David's good name and the board's trust as a shield. The payments weren't for a project. They were being funneled into George's personal retirement account. For 5 years he had been systematically embezzling from the community, right under their noses, right under her nose. He had supported her tyrannical reign because it was the perfect cover. As long as she had everyone focused on grass height and petunias, no one was looking at the real crime. Her obsession with order had made her the perfect shield for his chaos. The mudslide hadn't just threatened her presidency, it had threatened to unravel his entire scheme by bringing in an outsider like Alex who would actually ask questions. The final scene does not take place in a tense meeting room, but in Karen's quiet, orderly living room. The sun is setting, casting long shadows across the floor. Karen and Alex sit across from each other. The damning document with George's signature lying on the coffee table between them. The forensic accountant has left. The truth is theirs alone. For now, the silence is heavy, filled with the weight of betrayal. The enemy was never the free-spirited newcomer or the rigid HOA president. The enemy was the quiet, friendly man 2 doors down, the one who always brought a casserole to the neighborhood potluck. Karen looks at Alex. The man she had despised just weeks ago. His rebellion, his chaos, had inadvertently saved the community. It had saved her from continuing to be an unwitting accomplice. He played me, she says, her voice a near whisper, devoid of its usual authority, filled only with a profound, aching sense of foolishness. He used my grief, my everything. He used David. Alex nods slowly, his expression grim. He used all of us. The question is, what do we do now? They could go to the police. They could call another community meeting, a real one this time, to expose him. But George was well liked. The day Karen Peterson's world began to unravel started, as all her days did, with precision. At 0800 hours, sharp, clad in a blindingly white pantsuit she'd had custom-tailored for its authoritative crispness, she began her morning constitutional. This was not a leisurely stroll, it was a patrol. In her left hand, she carried the Harmony Creek Estates Homeowners Association Book of Covenants, Conditions and Restrictions, a leather-bound tome affectionately known to the residents as the Book of the Damned. In her right hand, she wielded her primary instrument of order, a telescoping aluminum ruler, accurate to a 32nd of an inch. Her first target was the lawn of number 12, the Henderson property. She extended the ruler with a soft schlick and knelt, her knees protesting only slightly. She placed the ruler's base flat against the soil. 4 1/8 inches, she murmured, a thin smile gracing her lips. The bylaw section 4, subsection C, paragraph 2, clearly stated that turfgrass height was not to exceed 4 inches. Infraction. She made a neat, decisive note in her pocket ledger. Next, her gaze swept across the street to her own property, number 11, model home, the gold standard against which all others were judged. Her late husband David, the HOA's founding president, had designed the landscaping himself. The azaleas were perfectly spherical, the boxwoods formed a flawless geometric hedge, and the centerpiece, a bed of pristine iceberg petunias, bloomed in a virginal white cloud around the base of the community's welcome sign, which stood, by no coincidence, on the corner of her lot. David had believed that order was not merely an aesthetic, it was a moral imperative. It was the bulwark against the chaos that lurked just beyond their manicured borders. Karen had taken up his mantle not merely as a duty, but as a sacrament, was admiring the petunias, considering their impeccable presentation, when the ground beneath them gave a soft, liquid burp. Karen froze. She blinked. The sound was vulgar, entirely out of place in Harmony Creek. It was the sound of indigestion. She took a tentative step closer, her brow furrowed. The soil around the petunia bed looked darker than it should be. The automatic sprinkler system wasn't scheduled to run until 2,200 hours, a fact she knew as intimately as her own social security number. Then came the second sound, a low subterranean gurgle, like a giant clearing its throat. The earth in the center of the petunia bed began to swell, rising in a grotesque parody of a baking souffle. The perfect white flowers trembled, their roots losing purchase. Karen took a half step back, her mind cycling through the Book of Covenants for a relevant passage and finding none. There were rules for seismic retrofitting, rules for sinkhole remediation, but nothing for this dot. With a final explosive thwomp, the world dissolved into a torrent of brown dot, a geyser of mud. Water and mangled grass roots erupted from the heart of her petunia bed, arcing high into the crisp morning air. It wasn't just mud. It was a slurry, a vile concoction of topsoil, clay, and what looked suspiciously like last night's spaghetti noodles. The deluge crested and then collapsed, directly onto her. The shock was absolute. One moment she was the arbiter of order, the next she was a Jackson Pollock canvas of filth. The warm, thick mud cascaded down her hair, plastering it to her scalp. It filled her ears, ran down her neck, and soaked through the impeccable white fabric of her pantsuit, weighing it down with a primal stench of wet earth and decay. A single, rogue earthworm wriggled valiantly on her lapel. For a full 10 seconds, she was paralyzed, a statue of mud-caked disbelief. Then, from across the street, came the sound that truly broke the spell, the peal of children's laughter, high, unrestrained, and utterly joyous. Her head snapped up. Through mud-caked eyelashes, she saw them. 2 small figures in the backyard of number 14, the new house, the Chen property. A boy and a girl, maybe 7 and 9, were jumping up and down, pointing, their faces alight with pure, unadulterated glee. Standing behind them, a tall, lean man with a disarmingly charming smile held a garden hose, a triumphant glint in his. This was Alex Chen, the software engineer from California who had moved in 3 months ago and had already accumulated 7 minor infractions, including an unapproved basketball hoop and wind chimes that produced, in Karen's official opinion, a cacophonous and spiritually unsettling jangle. Alex Chen met her gaze across the ruined landscape of her petunias and gave a little wave, the water from his hose still trickling into a large newly dug hole in his own backyard. The hole seemed to lead downward. Rage, cold and pure, sliced through Karen's shock. This was not a natural disaster. This was not a burst pipe. This was an attack, a targeted strike against the very heart of Harmony Creek's decency. She ripped the squirming worm from her lapel and flicked it away with a shudder of disgust. Her ruler was lost, swallowed by the mud. The Book of Covenants was splattered and warped. Her dignity was a casualty of war. She didn't storm over. She didn't shriek. Karen Peterson was a creature of process. She turned, squelching with every step, and marched back into her immaculate home, leaving a trail of muddy footprints across the Italian marble of her foyer. She stripped off the defiled pantsuit in her laundry room, dropping it into a biohazard bag she kept for gardening accidents. After a brutally efficient shower where she scrubbed her skin raw, she dressed in a fresh, dark navy skirt suit, armored. Her first call was to the HOA's legal counsel. "Harold," she began, her voice dangerously calm. "We have an incident. Section 7 subsection A. Unauthorized alteration of community property. Section 11 subsection D. creation of a public nuisance. And I want you to research liability. 4. Deliberate subterranean topographical sabotage. Her second action was to access the community security camera footage. The camera on the lamppost at the corner provided a perfect, damning view. She watched the recording and fast forward. There it was. Over the past week, during the day while she was at HOA administrative meetings, Alex Chen and his 2 children, Lily and Tom, had been digging. They had excavated a veritable tunnel, starting from their backyard and running directly under the sidewalk, under the street, and emerging with pinpoint accuracy in her petunia bed. It was an engineering feat of astonishing recklessness. The final clip from this morning showed Alex feeding a garden hose into the tunnel's entrance while his children watched with breathless anticipation. He wasn't watering his lawn. He was loading his weapon. The objective was clear. He had turned the common area into a terminus for a children's plaything, a mudslide. Her award-winning HOA-funded David-honoring petunia bed. Armed with digital evidence and a burgeoning legal strategy, Karen prepared for confrontation. She printed glossy high-resolution stills from the video footage. She highlighted the relevant passages in a fresh copy of the Book of Covenants with a highlighter the color of dried blood. She was not just a wronged homeowner. She was the agent of communal justice. This Alex Chen had mistaken her for a fussy neighbor. He was about to learn he had declared war on an institution, and she was its most fervent disciple. She marched across the street, her sensible heels clicking on the pavement with the rhythm of a metronome. The laughter had subsided, replaced by a wary silence as the Chens saw her approach. Alex stood protectively in front of his children, his easygoing smile replaced with a look of cautious appraisal. "Mr. Chen," Karen began, her voice devoid of all warmth. She held up a photograph of the muddy geyser. "Can you explain this?" Alex ran a hand through his perpetually messy black hair. "Oh, that? Yeah, sorry about the mess. The kids and I were just having some fun. We built a tunnel slide. I guess the water pressure was a little higher than I anticipated." "A tunnel slide," Karen repeated, the words tasting like poison. "You excavated a tunnel under a public sidewalk and a municipal street to terminate in a designated community garden bed, and you call it a tunnel slide?" "Well, yeah," Alex said, gesturing to his kids, who were peering around his legs. "Keeps em busy. Better than them being glued to a screen all day, right? It's creative." "Creative," Karen said, her voice dropping an octave. "Mr. Chen, your creativity has resulted in over $2,000 in damages to HOA property, not to mention the flagrant violation of at least 6 separate bylaws. Your children's plaything is an unlicensed, uninsured, and frankly, dangerously unstable excavation." Lily, the little girl, piped up, "But it was fun." The mud went whoosh. Karen's gaze flickered to the child, cold as a winter morning. "Fun is not a recognized exemption in the Harmony Creek covenants, young lady." Alex's posture stiffened. The last vestiges of his charming demeanor vanished. "Okay, look, lady, it's Karen, right? It was a prank. A harmless prank. I'll pay for the damned flowers, but you need to relax. It's a suburb, not a military state. It's a community of rules," Karen corrected him, her eyes locking onto his. "Rules my late husband, David Peterson, established to ensure the safety, beauty, and property values of every single resident. Rules you seem to hold in contempt." She thrust a sheaf of papers into his hand. "This is an official notice of violation. You have 48 hours to completely fill, compact, and resod the excavation on your property and the common area. You will also be fined $5,000 for the damages and an additional $1,000 for each of the 6 violations. Failure to comply will result in further